Hello, this is Greg, and I want to talk about ASP.NET Core Blazor render modes. This is a new feature of .NET 8, which is in its final release candidate at the time of this video. I'm sure by the time you watch this video, it will be out. All right, so this is a new feature of .NET 8, and it is fairly straightforward, and yet if you don't have a concept of what's going on with it, it can cause you some frustration, as it did to me. So I thought I would do a short video on this. Once you understand these modes, no big deal. But if you don't realize that things have changed in .NET 8, it might cause you some issues. All right, so let's go over here, and we're just going to spin up a project. All right, let's see, what are we in here? We're just going to close this one. All right, and we're going to say create a new project and Blazor Web. Next. All right, that looks good. .NET. Okay, so .NET 8, that's our only choice. No authentication, although individual accounts have finally arrived in Blazor as a first-class citizen, and the interactivity type, which is what we want to talk about. So you can have none, also known as static, and you'll see that later. Server, that's good old Blazor server, good old Blazor WebAssembly, and then auto server and Blazor WebAssembly. And so that's what we're going to pick, and we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. And our interactivity location, right? So the default here is per page component, and there's also global. Not really sure why they have a global, because if you were going to do it globally, well, why not just pick server? But in any case, we're going to select auto and per page, sample pages, and create. So this created a little project for us. I'm sure you've seen this one before. We'll run it just to make sure everything's running correctly here. All right, so as we see, we have home, counter, and notice it doesn't actually immediately start counting. I think that has to do with the fact that's interactive, but we'll come back to that later. And our weather component. All right, so now let's make things a little bit more interesting. We have this counter razor, and as you can see, we have two apps here. We have Blazor app 18, which is the server, and this one, which is clearly the client, right? And so in our components, in our layout, in our nav menu, we have this counter here, but it is in fact running on the client. So within one app, you can have some pages that are running on the server and some on the client. So that's really nice in case you had some like client heavy app. You could put a page down here in the client app, and it will run on the client. All right, so let's do something interesting now and copy this page here and then plop it up here on the server just to see what happens, right? Should run exactly the same, right? All right, and we're going to change this a little bit just to disambiguate, and we'll call it counter server, and I'm going to change this to counter server just so that it's clear that it's there, and we're going to run it and see what happens. So here is our one there, and we're just going to type this in manually, counter server. See, so now we're on the counter server page, and we're clicking, and how interesting. We have an exception down here, and and nothing's happening. What's the deal? I don't get it. Well, let's come over here and look at our console and see what it says. Root component could not be found, blah, blah, blah. Some sort of problem there. Let's figure that out. All right, so here's the problem. This little attribute right here says what mode it should be, because remember earlier we specified that we want to do this on a per component basis. Now, I don't like that wording, per component. In fact, it's per page, because all the components on a page inherit what is set for the page, right? And so anything on this, so really I'm just trying to say that it's page based, not component based. All right, so this render mode interactive auto is trying to say, all right, start it out as a server component and then pass it over and have it be a client app. Well, everything that's here on the server side has to be a server side component. You cannot have a client side component down here. If you do, it throws that exception that we just saw. Right, so let's come over here to our counter server, and I'm going to rename this just so that it's clear that it's a different component. All right, and we're going to remove this, and that should fix our issues, right? So let's fire it up. And we're going to navigate to our counter on the client. And again, it takes a moment to fire up, but we're now going to navigate to client or counter server. And here we are. And oh, it's still not working. What's the deal? All right, so let's get this fixed up so that it does work. So first we're going to undo. And so now, instead of calling this interactive auto, render mode interactive server. Now note that these, instead of using attribute, it's going to become a directive of render mode. So the syntax is going to change, but the functionality stays the same. So I'm sure by the time you try this, you'll see it slightly differently, and that's why, and that's covered in the docs. All right, so now let's run it again and see if we fixed our issue. And then we will talk about what that issue actually is. So here we are in our counter. We get a counter server. And sure enough, now we have this working, right? So really that's no big deal. But if you're not familiar with these render modes, they can throw you a little loop. All right, so just to reiterate, what gets set at the page level is what the entire page inherits. Things lower on the page cannot switch boundaries. So let's talk about that concept of boundaries here, because it is important. So for that, we're going to go back to the docs and look at our render modes. There's only 4 render modes, right? So static means don't do anything. It's just plain HTML, nothing interactive, right? So it's kind of like what we always have. Interactive server, okay, that's just regular Blazor server. This is just regular Blazor WebAssembly. And then there's the interactive auto, where it goes from server down to the client. Now, it's important to note that these are boundaries, right? Like anything that's an interactive server can have no interaction with anything that's in WebAssembly, right? Or that's in interactive auto, right? So they're their own different worlds, and they call those boundaries. So things cannot cross those boundaries, right? So that's an important concept. All right, so now let's go back to our app and look at our root page, right? So the app.razor is what was formerly host.cshtml or whatever it was called. So this right here, as you can see, has no attribute to say that this is server, static, client, interactive auto, nothing. Well, that means it's static, right? So it's important to know that, because if you come down here and you write some code and you put a button, I don't know why you would want to put a button in at this level, but one thing I did try to do is I tried to set a class, on the body for dark mode, right? Just using class and, and some code. Should have worked, but didn't. And I was like scratching my head going, what am I doing wrong here? Well, the root of an app is always static, and there's no changing that, right? Now, there are workarounds, to make it seem like it, but at this level, there's nothing. If you really wanted to set something here at the root level, you're talking JavaScript, but even that's not a good idea, because you could come over here and you could put a class on your body like I did, and the moment Blazor decides to refresh it, your class is gone and doesn't work, right? So just avoid putting any sort of interactivity here. So the next thing we have is routes, right? Now routes kind of looks like something that would be provided by the ASP.NET Core framework, but it's not. It's just another control, which is sitting right here. Now this is a router, and you could put a interactive mode here. Now the problem with doing that is that everything that goes through this router will inherit the mode that you put on this router. So again, you're limiting yourself to only server, if that's what you want to do, right? So if you want to, have both client and server, again, not a good place to put any mode. So that really only leaves us with the page level for putting your interactive mode. And that's perfectly acceptable, because, it's not that hard to put one. And as long as you know that is there, then it'll work just fine. So the difficulty I ran into is I was trying to get like some callbacks to work, some cascading values, and it was not working because I didn't have my modes set correctly. So really, that's the long and the short of it. If we go back here and look at the docs, you can see that. And then, it talks about, okay, adding it to your program. No need to worry about all of that. It's kind of set up for you. Apply a render mode to a component instance, right? So, you can do it to a component definition, so as long as you remember that you cannot cross boundaries, you'll do all right. Now, one thing you can do with the render mode is set that pre-render to false. Like for some reason, okay, you don't want to do any pre-rendering, just set that to false, and then it won't pre-render on the server. All right, so let's see. And here's an example of putting a render mode on a route, right? So you can even do it on the head outlet if you wanted to do that. I don't know why you'd want to do that. And then it talks about the static render mode, server render mode, and auto render mode, which is what we've kind of gone over. And this covers the fact that, okay, render mode inherits. Yeah, so that's really about it with render modes. Hope that helps out. I do like the idea of, okay, on this page, it's going to be on the server, and on this page, it's going to be on the client. You can mix and match, as long as you keep each page either client or server. All right, hope that helped. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you soon.